Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this session of the Promoting Positive Practice in the Classroom. Today, we are focusing on identifying our personal, vulnerable, and equitable decision points as a classroom practice. My name is Maria Reina Santiago Rosario, and I'm joined today by my peeps, Dr. Ruthie Payne-Simmons and Dr. Brandy Simonson. And today, I hope to keep things grounded, practical, and connected to the practices and the foundation shared through this series and the work for you in your classroom realities. As you know by now, this whole series is about building adult capacity so that students feel the impact of your hard work. It's work that's grounded in administrators supporting educators and educators supporting students' social, emotional, behavioral growth in a manner that keeps it authentic and really celebrates who your students are as individuals. If you're here as a trainer, coach, or part of a leadership team, take advantage of the materials of this session. It's recorded, and you'll have access to presentation, resources, facilitation guide to take back and make it your own. You've seen 6 of these 9 practices, and you can probably see by now how they're connected with each other. Today, we are talking about identifying VDPs and EDPs. We're really talking about the habit of noticing the real moments when our decisions are drifting toward being more reactive, being less aligned with our values, and on the other hand, moments where we've built structures that help even our snap decisions so we can stay instructional, responsive, and fair. So think about this practice as tuning your awareness so the rest of your classroom practices can land more consistently when it matters most. As our usual structure, we're going to be covering what vulnerable decision points and equitable decision points are. We'll be identifying why doing this practice matters for both yourself and your students. We're going to be looking at how we can implement this work and what it can look like in classrooms. Then we'll dip our toes into the work. You'll have time for guided practice. You'll have time to self-assess, to begin an implementation plan, and finish with planning for monitoring and adjusting the work based on your learnings. So we're talking about decisions, and teachers make so many decisions. Some research estimates that teachers make about 4 decisions per minute, which is about 1,500 decisions per day. And many of those decisions are really quick and they're unplanned, and speed, tired, a lot of things can get in the way, right? And we'll talk about what happens when we're in those moments and how does it affect our actions. So what are vulnerable decision points? VDPs are a specific moment when our decisions are more vulnerable to the effects of implicit bias. Or put it another way, these are moments when we are more likely to make a decision shaped by automatic assumptions rather than intentional, informed judgments, right? These assumptions are usually based on stereotypes that we've been exposed to throughout our lifetime, and they may or may not reflect what we believe or the values that we live by, but they still come out in our actions, and we all have them, even when we're affected by these stereotypes. VDPs are predictable moments, and I say that because empirically in data we can identify conditions under which there are differential treatment. Certain groups of people are experiencing worse outcomes than others. When we look at student outcome data like discipline or engagement or how our practices are distributed across student groups, we see that certain students are more excluded, are less engaged by our treatment, right? There are 2 elements that shape a VDP. Those are the situations, like when behavior is ambiguous or when we have to make quick decisions. Research shows that these moments are moments when implicit bias affect our action the most. There's also the internal state, how we're feeling. Are we feeling stress, fatigue, or frustration? That also influences how we react to an ambiguous situation or quick situation, right? So when we identify what we're VDPs, what we're really doing is naming the conditions that data show are most likely to affect our actions. The idea behind VDPs and EDPs is really informed by cognitive psychology research that describe two ways in which we generally make decisions. And VDPs often show up when we're operating in these fast automatic thinking or system one. I think about an automatic, when we're like driving and we're like in autopilot and suddenly I realize like I'm 3 streets past where I thought I was and I don't know how I got there. My brain was doing the work, but I wasn't aware of it. That's system one thinking. And in classrooms, as you know, we rely heavily on system one. We're making hundreds of decisions a day, right? VDP happens, fast decision making, when it intersects with situations that are ambiguous and are emotionally loaded and maybe happening under pressures. System two thinking is slower, it's more deliberate, like when we're learning to drive stick shift. It takes more effort, it takes more attention, we may have more time, and you can't really do the autopilot. EDPs work differently. We're really identifying or noticing the structures, the routine that we're putting in place that take the guesswork out of the moment. Let's look at an example. We have two students and they are talking during instruction, and you are in the middle of teaching and you're feeling mentally drained. And here comes the decision moment. You as teacher quickly need to interpret that behavior and decide how to respond. Possible interpretations, you may see that as disruption happening. Students may be confused or they may be collaborating, right? How you see that will influence how you react. Because it's quick and it's happening for a behavior that pushes your button and it's happening when you're tired, the immediate reaction became stopping instruction and sending the student to the office. And what happens after that? Students miss instruction, and you may gain some sense of control, but instruction momentum might have been lost. Here's another example. Many students, you just ask a question, and many students raise their hand, and you've fallen behind the lesson schedule and are feeling pressure to move things along, right? So the decision becomes, who are you calling on? Maybe the behavior doesn't really push your button, but the condition is really making you move towards calling on students who often give the correct answer because you're feeling the pressure. You want to move along the instruction. So what's happening? Some students receive more chances to participate and engage, likely leaving those who need more practice without that opportunity. And you as a teacher get to move along, potentially catch up. Right? These moments may seem small, but they occur dozens of times during a lesson and during a school day. And VDPs are reflecting moments where we and our implicit bias are making us or influencing how we act in a manner that's reactive and not instructional. So up to this point, we've been talking about VDPs. So now let's think of the opposite. Equitable decision points are moments where decisions are made in ways that produce equitable outcomes for students. And in these situations, when we examine data, we see disparities do not consistently appear across student group, or that we're responding in a way that is matching the need of the student. So let's say, they need more scaffolding, you're providing more opportunities to respond, you're being responsive, right? The conditions are making things less likely that bias is influencing the outcome. And often this happens under certain conditions, right? Thinking back to the situation and to the internal state. And the internal state, as the adult in the classroom, being calm, being aware of my personal reactions, being prepared and intentional in ways that I'm going to respond, help me be more instructional during VDPs, right? I can put in place equitable decision point conditions. Now, in terms of the situation, to get to that equitable outcome, we need to be grounded in good practices, right? Building positive relationships, having routines in place, and having taught those, getting input from our student and co-constructing and explicitly teaching classroom expectations, classroom rules across different types of routines, having clear criteria, like a rubric of how I'm going to grade or how I'm going to respond to certain behaviors, and having structures, like fairness tools that we use to allow us to be more consistent in the way that we respond. So with that said, we got to think about how are we informing, like who helped shape these expectations? Were student perspective considered when those routines were created? Are participation structures really designed in ways that are reflecting different communication styles and ways students engage in learning? So for these decision points to truly support equity, the expectation, the structure guiding them need to be intentional, need to be culturally responsive, and relevant to the students in the room. When those conditions are in place, our decision process is more consistent, more transparent, and more equitable for students. So let's return to that example, the one with the students talking while you're instructing and you're feeling drained and you send them out of the room, right? Sometimes has passed and you've had the opportunity to really reflect back to this moment, and not just this moment where it escalates, but maybe other days or other situations in which it doesn't become a problem. And you begin to notice certain things around your practice. For instance, you've noticed that when you move closer to students while you're instructing, any side conversation happening often stops quickly. You may notice that as a teacher, when you're acknowledging nearby students who are on task, other students follow the expectation, and you've created an opportunity to then acknowledge that student that was having some side conversations. And if those doesn't work, there's been other moments, right, that you may notice where a quiet nonverbal cue is enough to quickly redirect someone without disrupting the instructional flow, right? And becoming aware of that and thinking about how do I bring this in to stop this chain of a VDP. That understanding can help you plan a response ahead of time. So instead of stopping instruction, you may move closer to the student. You may praise nearby students, praise them if they're engaging on that, and if not, you can tap their desk if it's needed. And instead of them missing instruction, student may refocus and remain engaged and learning, and you as a teacher can continue your instruction. Let's do the same with the participation example. Many students are raising the hands after you ask the question, and you're feeling the pressure to move the lesson forward. And in the moment, it can be very easy to call on the students that you know are going to respond correctly so that you can quickly continue with the lesson. And over time, you may reflect on this, and you might notice that when participation decisions are made quickly, some students receive more opportunities to speak, and others participate less often, even when they're raising their hands. You may also reflect on when participation feels more balanced, and notice that when the selection process is more structured, more students have opportunities to contribute. So with that reflection in mind, the teacher can decide to use a predetermined structure, right, to stop this pattern. One example could be having like the participation sticks, right, to select which student is going to respond next. This structure helps distribute participation opportunities more evenly and makes the decision less dependent on the moment. So over time, because participation opportunities are guided by a consistent process rather than quick judgment, the distribution is happening more evenly, and that may increase engagement and learning. There are a couple of resources that I want to highlight before we move into implementation, with the first one being the 5-point intervention approach and the guide that goes into like several components, including identifying VDPs, engaging in culturally responsive practices, and engaging student and meaningful learning. It provides broad overview and guidance for implementing these ideas, the culturally responsive field guide, which includes different activities for the teacher to engage in self-reflection and assumptions behind behaviors that they may hold, activities to engage families and students in their understanding of behavior across contexts, way to engage students in more genuine relationships and finding and acknowledging their assets, as well as making curriculum more relevant and engaging. And also the lesson plan for co-creating classroom expectations with students. Together, these resources reinforce the foundation of a equitable decision point, right? Additionally, there are 3 other resources that I wanted to highlight. The Facilitating Civil and Productive Classroom Conversation Guidance and Lesson Plans, which provides practical strategies, lesson structures to facilitate respectful and inclusive classroom discussions, includes protocols, participation structure, routines to support student voice and engagement respectfully. There's 2 other resources here go hand in hand related to habits of effective classroom practices, and these are really tools to support you in being intentional, developing instructional habits over time through reflection, goal setting, and monitoring. Resources, the high leverage practice resources from the Council for Exceptional Children. Don't forget that you have access to the leadership and the faculty guides as well as the videos. And for this particular session, I think there's at least 3 that are very relevant and can benefit from us getting better at identifying vulnerable and decision points. Because as we become more aware of where those decision occurs, we can create opportunities to respond in ways that strengthen our relationships and how we're building our classroom environments. And I think those are the way that we're providing feedback in ways that are instructional, supportive, consistent, how we're providing opportunities to engage students in learning, like HLP 18, or how we're explicitly teaching expectations and social behaviors for students so that they can interact and regulate and participate in the classroom, like HLP 9. Now, why does identifying VDPs and EDPs matter? Research explicitly speaking to the idea of VDPs, EDPs, and how implicit bias affect decision making comes from work done school-wide through leadership team implementation of multi-component intervention, right, to address discipline disparities. Many assess its impact on reducing disparities for Black students, who is a group most affected by these inequities. And we've seen through that research reduced discipline referrals for everyone, but also reduced disparities in referrals for Black students in comparison to their peers. Other research that gets to the idea but may not talk about VDPs and EDPs, but it's really showing how self-awareness can help us change our actions, is research by Elisina that shows how these skills and being aware of it help reduce disparities in practices like grading. And the context for them was for immigrant students versus students native of Italy. Some of this research also shows improved school climate, as reported by students, family, and staff, improve student engagement and classroom interaction, where coaching is supporting teacher awareness of difficult routines and what can be done about it differently. It also shown to improve the quality of instruction and connectedness for Black students and increasing that sense for them, especially Black male students. So really, in summary, we see that this these strategies seem to foster a stronger sense of connection between teachers and Black students. It increases access to instruction, to learning opportunities, and the quality of those instruction, the student engagement, as well as strengthening equity by reducing referral gaps, grading gaps for Black students, immigrant students. We also see that it may contribute to positive school climate and folks' sense of safety within the school environment. And I want to wrap up this section of the why with a quote from Hayam Jinad, a teacher, psychologist, and educator, who wrote about the influence of teachers in shaping the classroom environment. Right? He says, I have come to the frightening conclusion that I am a decisive element in the classroom, that it is my personal approach that creates the climate, that it is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous, and I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor. I could hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de escalated, a child humanized or dehumanized, right? So he reminds us that teachers have tremendous power in the classroom, not just through what we teach, but through how we respond to students in everyday moments. So let's dive into implementation. This wouldn't be a presentation by the Center on PBIS if we're not talking about data. And in this case, data can help with a lot of things. And one of the things that it helps with is building awareness of when VDPs and EDPs occur. And we can see this through national patterns of school discipline data. If your school has this available, you can use your own school data, and the discipline disproportionality problem solving guide is there as a resource if you want to follow those steps. And there's also, of course, your examination of personal VDPs, which is really the focus of this skill building session. But we want to go a step further. We also want you to consider another way to begin identifying potential decision points, and that is by listening to students and their perspectives. On this slide, the feedback and input survey by the center is hyperlinked. This is a school-wide tool that gathers feedback from students, families, staff about school climate, expectations, fairness. And while the survey is designed as a for school-wide systems, the themes within it can also help educators reflect on classroom practices. So on this slide, there are a couple of examples of questions about fairness, participation, and teacher responses that can help surface moments where students experience decisions as predictable or consistent or less so. So there's a data component that can help us identify VDPs and EDPs, right? Like help us identify that situational factor, but there's also the habit building piece of it and thinking about our internal states and how we're reacting in those moments, right? So if we want to break down how do I identify a VDP, here's a step by step. Start with your own awareness. Start with a self-assessment. When do you notice yourself reacting quickly or in a way that's more reactive than typical, or moments when you're like, you don't feel proud of how you just acted? Look also at the available data, whether school-wide, if available, classroom patterns of your own practices. Are there certain situations, time of days, type of student interactions that show up more often and for certain groups of students? And then match what you notice with what the data shows. Does your experience match the patterns? What do you learn from that? Similarities or discrepancies, right? What does that tell you? So that you get to the point where you can identify what that moment is. and you can start watching for it more closely. So which moments in your classroom may be a VDP. And continue the cycle, right? Check on your learning, check on your progress, adjust as needed. What are you noticing about your decisions in those moments? How has that changed? What might you refine? Similarly, we want to be thinking about the step by step of identifying equitable decision points. And you can start not just with the trigger or that decision moment that affects, but also moments when you may be reacting differently to similar behavior. What does that tell you about the conditions in which it's happening, or what the student is doing, or how things are getting done, right? Consider the expectation or the rule that could be clarified to reduce like the ambiguity. What expectations determine what should happen? Have those expectations been thought or co-constructed with your students? Use a consistent response sequence as back to the examples, the proximity, the praise around, the respectful nonverbal cues, right? Steps that you will follow when this rule is broken, right? It's like that routine. When this happen, first when this behavior happened, I'm gonna respond in this way. And then think about, are there other structures that can support your fairness, or that supported your fairness within this equitable decision point, so that you can translate that information and try to adapt it for when your VDP is occurring. So what tools, what structures can help you make your decisions more consistent, fair, and instructional. So now let's take it live and try some guided practice. So we've had the opportunity, I've had the opportunity to share a little bit of ways in which we can be intentional with how we identify equitable decision points and turn that around to engage in similar ways during VDPs. But we wanted to make these a little bit more explicit and think about how can you make this collaborative with like your students, like how can you gather their input, invite input so that you can co-identify what may be tricky routines, what would have them feel more successful during these tough moments. You can invite families to give you input and understand like the way that they talk about behavior expectations or set rules in their home environment, right? And what can you learn from that and can maybe adapt into your classroom context. You can work with your colleagues to collect and review data, work at a chosen VDP, talk through strategies and EDP conditions that can support the way that you engage in different activities in your classroom. Examine whether behavior is interpreted differently depending on which student is doing it, right? That self-reflection, how implicit bias may be getting into your actions. Working on building routines that are really reflecting diverse ways of engaging, and we've had sessions dedicated to this, right? Inviting co-constructions of the norms, of the routine connected to that VDP, that student voice matters. Also consider whether the environment itself creates ambiguity. How can you make things clear and more consistent and explicit? And how are you teaching that routine and that procedures? How do you use predictable cues, visuals to support yourself, but also your students? And choosing responses that increase consistency, that increase clarity, that honor student dignity. So you have the opportunity to self-assess, and we've talked about intentional inputs. Let's move into thinking more closely about those intentional inputs and planning to engage in identifying VDPs and EDPs. So now let's engage in more reflection of not just your most common VDP, but also your existing EDPs and the decisions and the structures and the things that are in place that make other moments clear, consistent, instructional, and equitable. You're going to have the opportunity to estimate as best as you can your current practices and set realistic goals. Plan to shift your conditions. How are you going to remind yourself of engaging in this practice with more consistency so that it really becomes a fluent habit? And think about supporting sustainability. Identify a plan so that you can come back and self-monitor, that you can review your data, and you can learn from it so that you can adjust your practices and also celebrate your accomplishments and your growth and meeting your goals. There are two more resources I wanted to highlight that can support more of your planning and your monitoring. That is the routine assessment that we've developed as part of Project React to help us identify routines that are harder for us and routines that are more like run smoothly, and identify characteristics of different elements of those situations in ourselves. As well as the Be Positive app that we always encourage people to use for either setting pre-correction alarm or reminders that can help you engage in this practice. And as mentioned, we're going to come back to monitor and adjust our work. We trust that you're going to go out there and rock this work and work hard at getting better at it. But we want to also encourage you to monitor your effort, to use like checklists, weekly logs, journaling to remind yourself and continue building that habit. And consider other like reflection opportunities with colleagues, with students, like about what's working well, what's blocking your progress, what adjustments may be helpful, and how is your current practice aligned with that goal that you set for yourself. So last but not least, we've accomplished a lot. We've gone over what vulnerable and equitable decision points are, the interplay between the situation and the decision states. We've gone over research and what it improves. We've gone over intentional inputs. How can we set strong foundations for equitable decision points to then really integrate into a plan to use when we find ourselves in VDPs. So planning those responses and then planning to implement and monitor those classroom decision patterns, or continue to reflect on conditions that lead to both VDPs and EDPs and adjust as needed. Thank you for promoting positive practice in the classroom and being part of this series and this session. I hope you go off feeling more prepared to identify your VDPs and EDPs.